And here he is. Hi, Gary.
Hello.
Welcome to Busch Hall.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lynette.
I just have a few words of introduction before we jump in. I just want to remind everyone who's tuning in that Busch Hall is our virtual space where we reimagine art and identity through the lens of the Busch-Reisinger Museum. And the talks that we give here monthly with artists, students, scholars, curators are generously funded by our German friends of the Busch-Reisinger Museum, who support so much of what we do here at the museum, and to whom we are very grateful. As we begin today's talk, the Harvard Art Museums acknowledge that Harvard University is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past and present, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. So I'm very excited to be in conversation today with my close colleague, literally and metaphorically, Gary Van Zante, who's the curator of architecture, design, and photography collections at MIT Museum, which for those of you who are not familiar with Cambridge, is literally down the road from us here at the Harvard Art Museums. Since 2002, Gary has organized more than 60 exhibitions at MIT. Wow, that's a lot of shows, a lot of amazing work. And in 2015, did the first American exhibition of the work of the East German-born photographer Ulrich Wüst. And Wüst is going to be the subject of our conversation today. So welcome, Gary.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I should add, Gary recently published a monograph on Ulrich Wüst, the first book of its kind, in really the first survey of its kind, and is also in English. And we have a link to that book in our link tree. So if you want to check out and order Gary's book, you can do that directly in the link in our bio. So Gary, basically, I mean, there's so much that we could talk about in your vast career, but we decided that the point of intersection for us here at the Busch-Reisinger and the work that you do is, at least right now, Ulrich Wüst. And you were very kind to also write for our upcoming catalog that will be out next fall for our Made in Germany Art and Identity in a Global Nation exhibition. And so we look forward to publishing your work on Wüst in that context as well. But I was hoping we could just start kind of at the beginning, how you first became familiar with Ulrich Wüst's work, what drew you to it, and then maybe we can take our listeners a bit through his trajectory and maybe end with the work that we have here in the Busch-Reisinger.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. I think perhaps a good place to begin is particularly for your younger listeners, who I suppose anyone perhaps younger than 40 or so, who may not know much about or have only read about, certainly didn't experience unification of Germany, the dissolution of the German Democratic Republic, is referring to East Germany, where the photographer Ulrich Wüst was born and practiced for the first 15 or 16 years of his career. So there's that perhaps historical marker to identify at first. So we're talking about a period of time in a photographer's career for, as I said, over a decade of work, and then a subsequent career of now more than 20 years of work reflecting on that change historically. My involvement or my early recognition of this work came quite late, really, late 90s, 99, I think, maybe 2000, when I became aware of his work. But it was not until 2003 or 4 when I curated an exhibition at MIT on Berlin and the post-unification changes
Mm-hmm.
in Berlin that I made contact with him as one of the potential exhibitors in that show. He wasn't able to contribute to that show, but I maintained a correspondence with him and contact with him for a number of years, discussing the possibility of a monographic show now and then. But in those days, he was still reorienting himself, finding his way in a new museum and gallery, commercial gallery environment. Didn't in fact have gallery representation at first, so he didn't feel he could manage an international exhibition at that stage. Although he was contributing to exhibitions, of course, in Germany and across Europe. So it took some time. As you know, Lynette, exhibitions can take, well, we can do one in perhaps 3 months, or it can take 10 years, and certainly more than 10 years to arrive at MIT. And of course, it didn't really accelerate until the final years when we had a secure plan and a secure idea for an exhibition. I was very pleased to have collaborators in Berlin and also a collaborating institution, the Chrysler Museum of Art, that facilitated the project. So it came about in perhaps 3 years in the end of intensive work.
And it's great that you started us, at sort of reminding our audience also about unification, because I think that's actually one of the things too that once I started to get more familiar with Ulrich Wüst's work, it does feel like he is an artist who and you write about this to some extent in the book, is resisting a kind of historicization of the German Democratic Republic. And I think his work reminds us, because of maybe his, and we could get into that, the sort of shift in his work after unification, but that he's still very much active, right? And that this is not also sort of art historical work solely. And I think that's what drew me to it as well, that he was a figure also for the museum, where we could reflect on the German Democratic Republic, but we could also think about post-unification Germany in I think very unique and really compelling ways. So that you kind of started us there. Maybe give us a sense of what, because he was well recognized already in the 1980s in the German Democratic Republic, of what that work is like, what kind of characterizes that work for Wüst.
Yes, but let me come in for a second on what you just said, because it's an important point. I think in my own engagement with his work, and it was certainly reflected in the selections for the exhibition in 2015-16, but not for the later book that came out of that exhibition. My initial interest was the GDR years, and I think that reflected very much the scholarship and historiography during this period of discovery in the 1990s and early 2000s. That this was work that had not been known in the West, not been published and exhibited in the West, and so for everyone working in the field, historians and curators, this was a discovery period.
Yeah.
And of course, it was also a kind of Cold War fascination. I grew up during this time, and it knew very little about the GDR. So it was also that kind of discovery for an American audience, I think. But then working with him and working on the trajectory of his work over the decades, and particularly in the more recent times, post-unification, that was also a discovery that there was a continuity in his work. Of course, it didn't just stop in 1990. He somewhat redefined his directions. And had to also redefine his practice in practical terms. But he was engaged then with a lot of memory work and a kind of reflection on the GDR, but not in a nostalgic way, I think, but rather as a kind of, I wouldn't say documentarian, but he's a historian of the landscape, and this was the changes that it brought about was very much fascinating to him. So he developed a whole new kind of work reflecting on that. At the same time, he also had to reflect on, organize, and retrieve the work from the GDR years that was being requested by curators like me. So there was a lot of retrospective work also. And as you know, Lynette, because you have a very fine example of one, he developed this practice of archiving his work in leporello forms, accordion books. For most people don't know what a leporello is. It's an odd term.
I didn't either before I
Yeah.
started working on Wüst.
But I think the idea, if you think of the idea of a concertina or accordion where the pages span out over sometimes a very long distance, a very much of a challenge to exhibit, by the way, that he was archiving this as a retrieval system, and because they were recombinant, they could be created in many different ways, opened in many different ways, viewed in many different ways. So this was a unique form that became part of his practice and well suited his practice because he had so much work to retrieve and organize.
Yeah, and that's I think it's interesting actually because I think it was really, I think your exhibition in 2015 that was really for me the first where I really saw the work in person and where I also saw the leporellos, for the first time, and that was the focus there though on the cityscapes and on the landscape and the black and white photographs. It was actually, that's what I thought, that work from the 80s that I would be acquiring for the museum. And then when I saw the work that we acquired, and if anyone's interested, we do have an earlier post that shows the work that we're talking about, Ulrich Wüst's Hausbuch, that is in the Busch-Reisinger collection. But then it was, of course, it's always a difficult decision, but I thought in some ways the leporello as a form, and combined with this, looking back, creating a kind of palimpsest of his own imagery, but found images and objects really kind of brought a lot of things together in a way that maybe a series of the cityscapes, right, felt, I would still love to have that, of course, for the museum, but I felt like we could do a lot of work with the accordion book that we ended up acquiring.
Right. There were also, as you're suggesting too, there were other changes certainly in practice during this period, digital practice for one, and color work. So as you said, he's shifting during the 2010 and on into color practice, which changes his outlook a great deal. And of course, the prints are very different than his earlier 1980s and 1970s work, when he almost never worked in color and certainly wasn't working digitally. So this created another, really a more nimble practice where he could produce even more work, and he continued to produce a lot of work in the 2010s and to the present. He's continuing to work at roughly age 73, I think. He's very, very, very active, just as active as he was in his 40s.
Can I ask you to talk to us about Ulrich Wüst as a photographer? Because, you've alluded now, he worked primarily in black and white, which I know it was also because he could develop that work himself in the darkroom in the 1980s, and then the shift to color, but also there is a moment in our work, which you write about for our forthcoming catalog, where he actually has found negatives from a much earlier date and is printing those. So just a little bit about him as a photographer and how you see that practice, because sometimes it feels to me very different, right? He would actually get the color photos, printed elsewhere, right? And then at the same time was printing his own black and white photographs. How central is that, do you think, to understanding Wüst as an artist?
Well, I do see, as I think you do, I do see a shift in his work. It's not only digital practice, not only color work, but the focus the intensity of his work in a much narrower frame well after unification, after this period of kind of retrospective discovery and rediscovery of his own work, and a wider recognition for his work in the 90s and early 2000s. He's then turning back on his own immediate environment. In fact, literally the houses in which he lives in the country. And as your house book reflects, that it's literally a house book. That is a sort of still lifes of found objects that may or may not be his. Most of them, in fact, are early occupants of the house. So there's this sort of archaeological, there's this kind of stratigraphy that he's exploring in his own environment. And that redefinition, in a way, from this sort of expansive urban photography of the 1980s and late 70s and really into the 90s to his own immediate environment and circumstances in the north of Germany primarily. So it's also a period, and for me, probably the most interesting, fascinating discovery was his countryside work, which has now evolved in really the last 6 or 8 years. And where he's really focused now is on the villages and landscape of North Germany, where he lives at least half the year, not in urban photography anymore, certainly not Berlin, which has changed beyond recognition for him. And it's not about the changing landscape anymore, as it was in the 1990s, which fascinated. So now he's turned his lens to his immediate environment, the countryside around him. And I think what it reveals is that, he's a kind of poet of the landscape in a way, an historian of the landscape. It reveals the stratigraphy, as an archaeologist might discover it, of the rural agrarian landscape in the same way that he photographed this kind of palimpsest of Berlin. And so I find the same vocabulary, but now in a rural environment that also shows the evidence of human ambition. So.
And there, are those black and white?
A lot of that is black and white work, yes, primarily. The landscapes are primarily black and white. When he moves into the villages, which is more akin to urban photography, he tends to photograph in color, but it shifts back and forth. The object photography I just referred to in the house books is almost exclusively color. So.
We just had a comment in the chat, which I think is a great one. A mention that in the GDR, people referred to basically the log of visitors who stayed more than 2 nights in their house as the Hausbuch. And I responded briefly saying, yes, I think Wüst is playing with that idea, but maybe you could tell us a bit about how actually this idea expands beyond just people who stayed for 2 nights in his houses that he acquired after unification.
Well, there was, again, it's this sort of stratigraphy of settlement there, of exiles, of transients, particularly after the Second World War and during the GDR years and in the dissolution of the GDR. So there's a lot of prehistory as Wüst in the 90s occupies these houses. He's recording various fragments or traces of these past residents. But it's a reflection on, it's never without Wüst's characteristic irony. So I think there's a very important element here always. It's not in the sense of nostalgia for a kind of longing or yearning for the past, but rather a reflection on others yearning or longing for the past in this kind of ironic fashion.
Yeah, because we're talking about relics of people who've been there, over decades and decades, that he's sort of unearthing in his very meticulous archive of the contents of these houses.
And they're anonymous. I mean, and certainly unknown to him. So this is a kind of archaeology, really. Yeah,
and yet the point that was made last night at the wonderful panel that you did at the Goethe Institute by Andreas Krase, that one of those occupants is of course Wüst himself. So we get that it was also a self-portrait of, you know, where he lived and the space that he occupied, which
Yeah.
I found very helpful. I'd sort of forgotten. To add Wüst to that long list of people who had lived in those homes.
Interestingly enough, he's never done this in his city house, his Prenzlauer Berg apartment, where he has lived since the 1970s, because it doesn't seem to have a prehistory for him. So, I mean, there's perhaps no evidence of after so many decades of that prehistory. So, but yes, and I also, he was somewhat transient during those years, so there's more than one house involved, more than one history.
Right, I remember that, wrapping my mind around that as well, which also had to do with the history of ownership, during the GDR, and then afterwards, that, you know, Wüst was basically unable to stay in the home that he had initially acquired because someone else made a claim to that property. So it was just another layer of movement and migration in a way that only further, it just made me appreciate the work even more from that perspective.
And to return to your first question, I mean, it's a reminder again that 1989, 1990 was the beginning of a new past in Germany, and so he's reflecting on what came before, because that wasn't his history in these houses. But all around him, everything is changing, and it's a new country. The past is a foreign country.
You said several times now, you said, you know, he's not nostalgic, or that the work is not sort of nostalgic for a former time. And actually, I had that question come up with, so we also acquired two large prints of two of the object photographs from the Hausbuch, one of a grinder, sort of kitchen grinder, and one of a, you know, open and used bottle of or container of kind of scouring powder, right? But these he then more recently blew up as sort of large, you know, larger scale photographs. And it was in response to those that one of our faculty members said, well, you know, what does this have to do with, you know, this idea of nostalgie or nostalgia, this kind of nostalgia for the East and the consumer products that are no longer available. And it was interesting that it was that sort of isolation of those and blowing them up on that large scale that prompted that question. So could you tease out for me a little bit more?
I think it's a very good question, because they're powerful images, particularly in this kind of tradition of object photography that has a very long German history. But I think the clue there is this element, again, it's the irony, but the ironic element in those images is the background, which is not neutral. It's an old wallpaper that only could originate in the GDR. And I think by doing that, he's anchoring it, of course, in a past, but it's not, again, directly his past. So it's not a longing for another time, which, I mean, nostalgia has many meanings, of course. Yearning for place, yearning for one's memories. But it's, in his case, certainly not a longing, a personal longing, and has no personal nostalgia for the GDR years. In fact, he refers to the GDR as his eternal adversary. So, you know, it was difficult to work in the GDR. There are a lot of practical reasons for a photographer to feel that way. But in this case, I believe, reacting to the sense of nostalgia that developed around these objects after the fall of the GDR.
Others nostalgia around these objects. I think that's right. I mean, as far as I've been able to to think about it also in conversation with him. And maybe we could stay with the question of it, the GDR as an adversary, because you also point to in your book the fact that, you know, even the photographs he was doing during the 1980s of German cities and urban spaces in the East, that there was a kind of, I think you called it a subtly formulated critique of social conditions. And I thought, you know, maybe you could say a bit more about that, or, you know, where's that critique coming from? If we read out of the photos.
Right. Well, I think it's coming from him. It's coming from many different places, but I would say what I emphasize in the book is his, we didn't mention this earlier, his training as an urban planner. And in fact, he was a practicing planner, and his perspective on the GDR city, the urban experience that for him was mostly negative. I mean, the industrialized housing blocks, the dehumanizing, he would call it, city, which led him to resign from planning and take up photography professionally. So that's certainly a powerful motive throughout, where his interest is in the historic landscape. But yeah, I don't know where else to take that, in the sense that it's not his personal experience that he's photographing. And I'll return. In fact, I was losing my thread for a moment there. I'll return to your question about the representation of the city, that the idea that this might be seen as a critique was, of course, on his mind, but a bit treacherous. You know, could this be subject to censure? And in fact, was at one point. Other photographers like Helga Paris, for example, faced greater challenges this way. But Wüst always had to tread a little bit carefully there, because it could be seen as a critique in exhibitions in the GDR or in publications. But as he put it, he was picturing living conditions as they were, and who could argue against that?
Well, that's the advantage photography. That's the advantage photography had, right? That, you know, you could say, well, I'm just depicting what, you know, my lens is somehow, you know, objective, and therefore I can stand outside of.
Right, the argument of realism, documentarianism, or documentary photography. So yeah, but I don't think he wasn't hiding behind that. But there were moments when work was questioned on public display. So he always had to be prepared for that criticism.
So I have maybe one final question before we probably have to wrap up, and that is, you know, thinking about Wüst today, which is also, you know, really one of the big questions of our exhibition next fall, is really thinking obviously historically about questions of German art and identity, but also today. And, you know, the fact that Wüst is still very much active in both looking at his former practice as, you know, exhibitions and also his thinking about his own archive, but also making, you know, new work and new series. And how do you think about a sort of artistic development, right, that had, I mean, you mentioned several times, and he has mentioned that himself to me, the challenges, right, of after unification, right, not having the state support anymore, right, maybe living very frugally in order to bridge those initial years until, let's say, finding a gallery or these kinds of things. What is the message? What is the resonance of this artist, of this body of work, would you say, for, you know, your students, our students, for generations of Americans who saw your show, you know, might see our show next year? What would you want, you know, the takeaway for them to be about, you know, what is German? What is German art? That's a big question.
Well, yeah, it is a big question. I mean, this is a photographer who has a deep involvement with place and memory, and he's still very much engaged with the memory landscape in Germany, but how is that defined? He would say now, I think, that let's forget about the GDR. I mean, I've had my period of reflection, of retrospective work. I've had my period of exhibiting that work. I've come to, it's a little loaded, the German term, come to terms with the past, but in a sense, that's a kind of reckoning with the past. But I've moved on. My recent work, I'm speaking in his terms now, my recent work would be the German countryside and a different kind of memory landscape. It's not about the GDR. It's about, I'm an historian of the landscape, and it's about a broader sense of the landscape around me now. That's no direct reference to the GDR years. But I think there's a long period of this transition, much like Germany itself, in reckoning with this, really the place of the GDR in the history, the future of Germany.
I mean, a reckoning which is still happening. It doesn't mean that Ulrich Wüst needs to concern himself with it necessarily anymore. Right. So
yes, I think he really wants to be seen as having moved on, and is, he's still active, as I said, very active and doing new work. So he's just very much engaged with place and memory, and that's not the reflection on the GDR years any longer.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you so much, Gary. This has been really wonderful, digging into Wüst's work with you again. And I know you're on to many new projects, and but I do hope that that we can continue to think about Wüst, especially next fall, when our Hausbuch Leporello and the accompanying photographs are going to be on view here at the Harvard Art Museums. Maybe we can entice you back to give a gallery talk on the work. But I'm looking forward to seeing it installed, because if your show at MIT is any indication, it's going to be a challenging but a very beautiful installation. So thank you again for joining us on Busch Hall.
Thank you, my pleasure.